Thank you for listening to the Solanos Stories, a companion to the Smithsonian's traveling exhibit, Crossroads Change in Rural America, presented in downtown Trinidad, Colorado. Solanos Story salutes the farmers, ranchers, cowboys, and cattlemen who helped shape the Southwest, and their trusty hats. Chuck Cusimano, written by Chuck Cusimano. I was hanging around town, spending my time, out of a job, not earning a dime. So goes the famous words to an old classic cowboy song, and the way I was feeling several years ago when in walked a cowboy with an old beat-up hat and announced to Mr. Ralph that he was in need of a new hat. Mr. Ralph was the boss of an outfit called Solanos Western Wear in Raton, New Mexico, and we'd become pretty good compadres ever since I arrived in town. He assured me every day that somebody would put me to work soon, and this looked like a good chance. Well, the feller shook hands with Mr. Ralph and told him a couple of jokes, I reckon, because Mr. Ralph laughed and slapped the newcomer on the back, and then this newcomer got a serious look on his face and said something as he took off his old, beat-up, sweat-stained, battered black felt lid, and in no time at all they was headed in my direction. One thing you need to know about hats is that as soon as someone touches you, you start to get vibes and feelings about the person handling you. I liked this fella right away, although his hands were rough and calloused. He held me as gently as if I were a baby. I could also pick up the feeling that this man respected hats and wasn't the kind to abandon me for a cowboy hat's greatest enemy, the dreaded, disgusting baseball cap. No siree, this feller I could tell had grown up on a ranch and was taught the real respect the cowboys have for real hats. I could also tell that this man knew a real hat when he saw one. The man paid for me and took me over to the steamer and collaborated with Mr. Ralph, and between the two of them came up with the shape that suited my new owner. I found out by keeping my mouth shut and my ear to the ground that this feller had a name. His name was Chuck something, but it took a while to figure the last name out. Soon we were a team, and as Chuck and I went and made our rounds in Raton before we headed back to the ranch, he sure did get a lot of compliments on me. By the time we got back to Raton Ranch, where Chuck was working for his dad, Louis Cusimano, that was Chuck's last name, too. What a coincidence. I had picked up a lot of information about my new boss. That is also the same day I met another black felt hat that as soon as we walked into the camp, Chuck put me on the hat rack, grabbed the other guy, and headed out the door. I took a little nap, and soon Chuck and the other hat came into the camp, and the other guy was put up on the rack. And Chuck went about his business of fixing supper, and after that he went into a little closet-looking outfit, and I guess it rained in there because soon he came out naked and wet, and then he dried off and put on some clean clothes and grabbed some kind of a thing I found out later he called a guitar, and then he took me with him again, and we went to Raton, where he played and sang country music at a place called the Carriage House with some other fellers. Chuck and I became the best of friends and were together for about 8 or 9 years. I finally figured out what his name for me was. My dress hat, and the name of the other guy I found out was my work hat. I went to calling the other guy Work, and he called me Dress. Well, old Work would tell me what to expect when he got retired to this old hat's home, and I started going with Chuck on the long days of riding horseback, fixing fence, working on windmills, feeding, putting out salt, working on roads and trails, cutting cedar posts, putting in those dang water gaps in the Canadian, and all the other things that sure seemed to make him happy. Seemed to me like the more he sweated me up, the happier he was going to be when my time came to replace Work. That time came, and I learned even more about Chuck Cusimano. Seemed he and his brother owned one of the oldest Colorado brands, called by some folks the Open A4, but I've heard 'em both call it the Open Across or even the Open A+. It looks like this, and I guess they all work. I had quite a few close calls after he changed my name to my work hat and gave my old name to the new guy. One day we were riding over in the No. 5 Canyon and came upon a dead wild horse that the bears had been cleaning up, and I was real sweaty, and as Chuck bent over to get a look to see if the lions had killed the horse, I fell off onto a pile of bear crap. It was awful, but Chuck cleaned me off in the grass and let me go home with him anyway. Another time I got knocked off by a limb, and Chuck couldn't stop to pick me up because the cattle were trying to get away, and I laid there a long time before he came back to get me. And I heard him tell his dad that he lost me, and I do think he was as glad to see me as I was to see him. Sure enough, one day he went to town and came back with a new hat that looked just like me, and my old buddy my work hat disappeared, and I didn't know what happened to him until several years later when I wound up here again in Solanos Western Wear, just hanging around, spending our time out of a job and not earning a dime.